Hello, folks. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. Welcome to the first ECI book club of the year. This is our first book club where we have our author here with us in person for in real time conversation. So thank you, Karen. Before we get rolling with our conversation, I want to start by just telling you how the day will flow. So first I'll share some announcements, which will both serve as announcements and give us a little bit of time for folks who need a couple extra minutes to get here. Then I'll give an introduction, and Karen and I will talk for in between 20 and 30 minutes. During that time, when Karen and I are talking, we'll be highlighting the implications of her work for character educators, and y'all should feel abundantly free to go ahead and include comments and questions in the chat. We will address them in the last half of our discussion, and you'll have a chance to participate by raising your digital hand and asking a question directly, or by placing something in the chat, but you don't have to hold off until the very end to do that. Okay, so with that, on to announcements. The first is that we would love for anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to do so to join the ECI community. We have our big grant announcements coming out later in October, so you'll want to make sure that you get those. Second, we have another webinar coming up on October 14th. That's with Angel Parham from UVA, and she'll be talking about community engagement and service learning. And third, if you want to come back to our second book club of the fall, on October 23rd, we'll be talking with Kate Denial about her book, A Pedagogy of Kindness. And all those links are in the chat. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Stohr, who is a Ryan Family Professor of Metaphysics and Moral Philosophy at Georgetown University and a Senior Research Scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Her primary research area is ethics, especially contemporary Kantian and Aristotelian ethics. She's particularly interested in the ways in which moral values and ideals get expressed in social life, and she's the author of 3 books on manners, Minding the Gap, Moral Ideals and Moral Improvement, and Choosing Freedom, A Kantian Guide to Life. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washingtonian, Notre Dame Magazine, and other publications. She is a frequent guest on radio shows and podcasts, and is interested in the moral aims of dinner parties. And I hope maybe that we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about dinner parties, but if we don't, feel free to bring it up in the chat. And Courtney, I think we may have the wrong folks pinned. I'm not sure that Karen and I are pinned yet. But anyway, that's not essential to the conversation. So Karen and I will dive into it. Okay, so Karen, I want to start off by picking up on our conversation yesterday or the day before. And one of the things that I most appreciate about Minding the Gap is that here at Wake Forest, in our approach to character education, we draw heavily on neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics. And I think there are a lot of good reasons to do that. It gives a lot of words, a lot of concepts to describe what character growth and moral growth entail. But at ECI, we often tell our community members that Aristotle doesn't have a monopoly on character growth. He's not the only source of concepts that are useful to describe what the moral life looks like at its best. And I think your book is a really good example of how you can describe moral growth in a good moral life without talking a whole lot about virtue, useful though those virtue languages. And you do that by offering this idea of moral improvement, which has a lot to do with another concept, which is central to your argument, which is about aspirational moral identities. So can you tell us what an aspirational moral identity is? And to make this very concrete, if you're willing, tell us what your aspirational moral identity looks like at 20 and what your aspirational moral identity looks like at 40. And I encourage everybody to do this thought experiment with us.
And we could do it again. Oh, wait, am I freezing? No. Okay,
No, you're good.
sorry.
You're
My
good.
my Wi-Fi and Zoom don't always play well. First of all, thank you, Liz, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk about this project and hear people's thoughts on it. So, I the sort of the central thing that for me, part of this book was just trying to figure out like how is it that we actually go about improving ourselves? And here, just like thinking of ourselves as adults, like on a daily basis, where we have that like, oh, that wasn't my best day, right? Or like I did pretty well there, and trying to think through those things. And so this idea that's at the center of the book, this idea of what I call an aspirational moral identity, it isn't supposed to be like a super technical or precise term. It's supposed to capture sort of a lot of ways of thinking about identity and moral identity. But the key thing is that it's a kind of a representation of like how we want to be. And so that maybe an easy way to get hold of it is when we just think about when we've sort of failed to live up to that and like we've done something that doesn't really represent who we take ourselves to be. We're like, that's not really who I am, or at least isn't who we want it to be. So that's the part that makes it aspirational. When we're like, this isn't exactly maybe how I am all the time, but it's who I really think I should be and who I want to be. And so that's very much at the center of the book because the thought is that how do we sort of understand what those identities are? How do we develop them? How do we articulate them? And then obviously, how do we manage to live up to them? So, yeah, the question about like what was it when I was 20 and when I was 40 was a long time ago when I was 20. So, I have to think through this a bit. But I think like a lot of students too, like I actually planned to go to law school and then I was going to go work in like international development. I had lots of plans to go out and like sort of do good in the world. And then, things took a turn and now I mostly like think about what would be doing good in the world rather than doing it. But I think that part of that like trying to sort of sort out, like in the way that I think lots of people do, you want to live a life that makes a difference somehow, and you're trying to work out what that would look like because you don't really have a good sense of what such a life would be. And then I think at 40, by that time I was settled in a career, I had two kids, and there's like all these different pieces of it. And some of that becomes more concrete. You have more developed ideas about what contributions you're making, but you're also doing things like parenting that you really have no idea how to do that or what to do. So there's a lot of different sort of complexities. So I would say that when I was 20, it was pretty broad and vague. And at 40, it becomes more concrete, but also really more specific. I'm thinking more in terms of being a good parent, a good spouse, a good teacher, a good colleague, a good friend, of course, daughter, all of those things become more concrete. And I think that concreteness is one of the things that really shapes the project of the book.
Yeah. And I mean, you've made some commitments to some social roles by the time you're 40. And when you're 20, it's like the world is wide open. You might get married, you might not. Who knows what your career is going to be? Um, so, how does social roles function in helping people have a sense of what moral aspirations they're reaching for?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm often struck by that happens, so I teach, like Georgetown, where I teach, has a two-course philosophy requirement, one of which has to be ethics. So I am spend a lot of time teaching ethics to a bunch of students who aren't necessarily choosing to be there and trying to sort of give them, and also aren't sure like why anybody needs to be in an ethics class. And so I'm often trying to sort of figure out ways to articulate to them like what kind of project ethics is. And we have these sort of ideals. So if you're teaching Aristotle, you might be talking about the idea of Aristotle's the phronimos, the practically wise person, the fully virtuous person. Kant has an idea of the ideal of a person with the goodwill. So you have these ideals, but they're pretty vague. And they also sometimes to students seem really tied, maybe especially in Aristotle's case, to like what life was like for him or certain kinds of assumptions that maybe are problematic. And so students are like, but that's like, what does that have to do with me in a sense? And I think that's a really legitimate question. When I'm asking students to think about what do you think would be a good life for you, it really has to be tied to sort of who they are and what they're thinking about. And one of the ways that is, I think, most helpful is to get them to think about it in very concrete ways. So for college students, that's like, okay, what is it to be a good friend, a good roommate, a good kid? As I often talk about things like filial morality and Confucianism, like what do you owe your parents? So I think that social roles are a good way of getting a foothold sometimes into the kinds of moral concerns that we want students to think about. And of course, they also shape what some of our commitments are. You know, if you have kids, then you're going to be thinking about being a good parent. You know, if you have parents, you're going to be thinking about being a good kid. And so I think it's a combination of the social roles that we have already sort of constrain the questions that come up for us or shape the questions. And then also, they give content to them in a way that makes those discussions, I think, more useful or more meaningful for students and for all of
And
us.
it's real content. It's concrete because it's like, what does it mean to be a good sister or a good classmate or a good roommate? But it also, there's still a question mark at the end. You know, like there's real room for inquiry into the question, what does it mean to be a good daughter? You know, and that's one of the things I love about it is that there's you like that your model gives people a lot of room to wrestle with the meaning of these roles.
Yeah. Yeah. And it gives the ways, I mean, because often the questions, like when we're asking, like, what is it to be a good daughter or what is it to be a good friend? We are asking basically the same questions as what is it to be a good person? Because
Yeah.
very often those questions really are moral questions. They have a moral dimension to them. They just do because they make it a little bit more concrete. It gives you like a place to talk about the significance, for instance, of, you know, being present to people, or being, you know, attentive to their needs, or, you know, setting boundaries, all of those things that students already have a lot of views about. But I think for all of us, when it becomes more concrete, it gives us a sort of a better foothold, both into what it is that we're aiming for and also like pathways to achieving it. It's easier to think about this. So some example from my own life. I live in DC, traffic is bad. I am not a very patient driver, and I know this about myself. And I'm always like, I should be a more patient driver. I definitely should. And being patient, like I should be more patient generally, but being a patient driver is specific enough that it gives me ways of thinking about like what am I doing when I don't want that person to merge or whatever it is that I'm doing. And so I think it does give us ways of sort of specifying the specific actions that we want to take to live up to our ideals and also just trying to think through those ideals.
Mhm. Another thing I love of I'm not doing a good job of asking you questions. I'm just gonna I'm just gonna respond to statements and you roll with them as you want.
Okay.
And I'll come to a question if we get stuck. But one of the things I loved about a role-based approach to ethics also is that you make people ask me all the time, how do we respect students' agency while doing character education? You know, how do we avoid just imposing our belief systems on them? And you make this great point that for the project of moral improvement to get off the ground, I have to believe in whatever the norms are. Like I can't moral improvement only works if I actually aspire to the moral identity. And it will only work for our students if they actually aspire to whatever moral identity is at play. And but they are already bought in to particular roles. Like they do generally, oh, if they have think of themselves as a sister or as a worker or as a citizen, they already have a sense that that role matters and it matters to do it well, which is something I think it's really important for character educators to be asking what are our students' existing motivations and how do we work with them instead of against them. Um, and I and I wonder to what extent, if that's the case, if that's the case, it seems like there are these two things that character educators can do. And I'd love your thoughts on this. We can give students resources and time to reflect on what does it mean to be a good insert social role, which is a way of reflect on what does it mean to be a good person. But we can also give them invitations to try on new social roles. What are your thoughts?
I think both of those are important. I mean, I think like the social role, like sort of giving them a space, like this is actually something we have to talk about or figure out. Like, you know, right now, AI raises lots of questions. I mean, questions we've partly seen before and some we haven't about what it means to be a good student. Like, what does that involve? You know, new questions. And we don't always put it that way, but we can easily frame the questions or some of the things that trouble us about this. So we can be like, hey, it's really important for us to think through this. And it's not something that we're going to impose, I mean, we could try, but it doesn't work. We all know that
Doesn't
very
work.
well. If you just try to be like, this is what I say, it's going to be a good, this is going to make you a good student. It's from that perspective, like, okay, what do you think of as being a good student? Like, what matters to you about this? What is it that you're aiming for in pursuing this education? And that's crucial to me. I think that like it doesn't improve if ideals are imposed from the outside, or it's just like, oh, Aristotle said this, so it must be true, so you should do it. Like that doesn't work, of course, for any of us, and also can just seem really sort of remote from their actual existence. So I think when we pick up on what's going on in their lives, then we can raise questions for them. But it's also true, certainly for college students, that they're often taking on new roles, they're joining new clubs, or they're doing things that are kind of new. And so it also raises conversations for like, okay, if you're taking on this role, like this new leadership role in this club, what do you think it means to be a good leader of a club? And, students have generally thought some about that, but maybe not articulated it in a very practical way. And it could also be partly like as they're starting out new roles, um, thinking, okay, let's help you think through what would it be to do this thing that you've just said you would do and do that well.
Yeah, any transition, any adoption of a new role is this like perfect window for
Yeah.
moral reflection on who they
Yeah.
aspire to be.
And let them know that that's a process that you work out. It's like my analogy with parenting that feels like one too. Like you start out like, you start like this baby and you're like, I don't know what to do. And like nobody knows what to do. Really, you're trying to figure that out as you go along, and you have these ideas like, oh yeah, this is what good parents do. And then you're like, yeah, okay, that does not work. Or that I was wrong about that, or that was much too. And I think that's true with all of us. We start out thinking, okay, I've got this leadership role or this job, and this is how I'm going to make it work. And then you try it and you're like, actually, that isn't working very well, or that isn't really helping me do the things that I'm hoping to do. And so it's really important, I think, that we give students space not to just like come up with how they think about their aspirational identities and roles, but also I think that these things get revised as you go along and you learn more about what actually doing well as a student or as a leader in a club or as a child or friend
Mhm.
means.
Mhm. It makes me think of this emerging literature. We've all heard of a growth mindset, but there's an emerging literature on a moral growth mindset, which is what it sounds like. It's the idea that I can grow and change
Yeah.
morally, which is an assumption that's just baked into your work that people have that if people have had an educational experience that teaches them that their aspirations can change, but also that their ability to live into those aspirations can change. Well, now
Yeah.
we're in moral growth mindset territory.
Yeah, that sounds right. The moral improvement feels like moral growth mindset.
Yeah. Well, speaking of pairing concepts, what what do you think is the relationship between moral improvement and character development? Are these terms synonymous? Is there what are the wrinkles that make them different ideas?
I think they're pretty similar. I think it's just when we're thinking of ourselves, I mean, in some ways, I think it depends. Like when we're thinking about, like your kids or your students, you're focused on like, oh, I want them to be good people. So you're thinking often of character traits, and obviously the ways in which character traits lends itself to interdisciplinary thinking that enable you to sort of, think about traits in sort of robust and psychologically well-grounded ways is really, really useful. And I think we do think about ourselves that way. Like I just described, like I'm not a patient driver. Like that seems like a character trait. If I can become a more patient driver, I'm not having a lot of luck with this, but that seems like that would be a development or improvement of my character. But sometimes I think that character talk can be very vague too. Like what is our character? And it's even harder to see from the inside what somebody's character is. Like we have kind of a sense of it. And so I think that they're mostly kind of overlapping in which terms we're using. Might just depend on the context in which we're using it. But I think like the question, like, okay, I want to be a more patient person or a more patient driver, whatever it is, that could be understood either way, character development, or is like a way in which I want to improve and become what I regard as a better person.
Mhm. Yeah. That's what I thought. I thought that there was a lot of overlap between the concepts, but you never want to assume. Um, you talk a lot. I wonder if I loved your chapter on the remains of the day. I
Yeah.
believe that was chapter 2. And and we can talk about moral improvement in character. Character education, we often do talk about it as the acquisition of these new traits, the acquisition of virtues like patience. But in that chapter, it seems like what happens with this, the story of moral improvement that you describe is of a butler who has one story about what it means to be a good butler and a good person, and that story just falls apart. The role stops making sense to him, and he eventually has to reconstruct a life narrative. And that seems to me that narrative shift seems to be one thing about your work that I think character educators could learn a lot from, because it's not just he goes from thinking, oh, I need the virtues of a dignified butler, to, oh, I need some other traits, insert whatever the blank is. He has a whole new story about who he is and why his life matters. um and you also use this term, I think it's roughly synonymous with aspirational moral identity, which is the fictive self.
Mhm.
And they're both about, the fictive self is like, what role am I playing in this narrative? Um, so how do you think, what do you, this is, y'all, I'm throwing Karen kind of a curveball, but what do you think the role of narrative is in moral improvement? Or what stories we draw, which stories we draw on shapes the people that we're trying to become?
Yeah, okay, there's a lot there to talk
Yeah.
about. So let me try to like throw out some other things too, and then you pick up on what you think
Okay.
would be most interesting. So on the kind of the aspirational moral identities and the fictive selves, which I know is a lot of jargon, but here's the idea. It's actually in some ways kind of straightforward. Here's just an example of what I think we're all familiar with. So like let's suppose that like you and a colleague who you really like, you're friends with, are both up for a promotion and the your colleague gets it and you don't. We often have that experience of like we sort of want to be happy for the person. We think we should be happy for them, but we're not actually happy or as happy as we want to be because we're disappointed in a variety of ways. And that the aspirational moral identity part is the part of me that likes, I really want to be happy for my colleague. They deserve their promotion, they'll be great, all of that too. Like you want to be happy. But then because you don't actually feel it. So the gap in the title is this gap between like how we think we should be and then the way that we actually are in real life. And the fictive moral identity is the part that kind of helps us like step in between that. So the fictive moral self is the when you act in a way that corresponds with the self that you want to be. So you act happy for your friend, and it's accurate. Like it's really you. I mean, sometimes you're just pretending, but sometimes it really is you because it reflects your beliefs. It's just that you can't really be that person that you want to be. I think this happens to us all the time in our, at least it happens to me all the time in my ordinary life. You know, like somebody gives you a gift and you're like, oh, it's not exactly right, but you sort of put on a good face. And I think that's actually a very morally significant thing to do because it helps sort of us be the people that we think we should be, or some like better versions of ourselves. And I think that this is all very relational as well. So when I act happy for my friend who got the job, and she might know that I'm really disappointed, but I'm acting happy, but she sort of helps me maintain that. This is, I talk about as holding someone into that identity. So even though we know I'm not as really that happy, there's another sense in which I want to be. So that's that kind of this sort of structure of like a fictive moral self, which is like a, in some ways like a put on self, but it's not just like a facade or not just like a sham or a pretense. It's more than that because it does represent who we want to be. And I think that the remains of the day, one of the many reasons I love the novel, and the movie is really good too, because it's Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson, so how could it not be? Is that his character, Stevens, the butler, we see a lot about both how he's trying to characterize like the person that he wants to be. So he has this ideal of a butler, and his conception of what it is to be a good butler is partly internal and also partly external. So he's always in this conversation with this external group who's like laying out the standards. This is a good butler, right? And he accepts it in some ways, but also wants to press up against it because he realizes that that definition isn't perfect. So he's trying to work out his own conception of this. And then he's trying to live up to it. So we have this really interesting narrative where he's really trying to think like, yeah, this is what I think it is to be a good butler in this case, which for him is pretty much just being a good person because he is like, his whole world is being a good butler. And so there's that dynamic. And then you get this very interesting situation where in some sense, his world falls apart. And it falls apart in a couple of ways. I don't want to give spoilers. It falls apart kind of internally. As it turns out, he actually can't really live that way. This being a good butler is going to be some internal tension. And also because he lives in a world in which the social structures that inhabit a butler are kind of falling apart too. So he can be a butler like in this particular physical location of this great hall with people who understand what that role is, but then he leaves there and people have no idea like how to interact with him in that way. So he faces these really interesting challenges to who he thinks he is and what he believes, and he has to figure out like how to adapt that. And I think that narratives like the, I mean, everybody has variations of these experiences in their lives, but I think narratives also, especially for like college kids who are in this big point of transition, help kind of like help us all get a grip on like, okay, what's happening here is I'm trying to like sort of carve out a new sense of who I am. And I don't really know what that means. Like, I don't really know what that is. I just know like the old one doesn't quite work. And I'm just trying to work this out. That uncertainty, which is very disorienting, and thinking about what is like sort of the way to kind of support all of us, but students in particular, as they try to work through who they can be and who they want to be given the circumstances that they face.
Yeah. It's kind of like every coming of age story.
Yeah. Yeah, it is actually kind of a coming of age, although it's kind of like a falling apart of age, this, because the character does kind of, well, I don't want to give giveaways, but you should read it. Ishiguro is phenomenal. It's my favorite of his novels.
Um, well, I want to give time. I want to turn it over after this one last question. So we haven't talked much about good moral neighborhoods. I don't think we've mentioned them at all. But you did say just a minute ago that we hold each other into these roles, into the ideal versions of these social roles. Can you say what a little bit more about, maybe a little bit more about holding each other, but more about what good moral neighborhoods would they do? How they help people move toward their aspirations, morally speaking.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite ideas in the book, this idea of a neighborhood where that includes both like the physical and social structures that we find ourselves in, because these things sort of constrain and shape what we can do in any given case. So everybody's had the experience of like finding yourself in a physical space that seems very foreign or overwhelming and you don't really feel like you can act. Happens a lot to students, at least for us at Georgetown, no doubt at Wake too, right? Students who are like first gen students and come onto like a college campus with Gothic stuff. It can be very like unsettling. And so the ways, the interaction between like the physical spaces and the social spaces and how people can act within those spaces forms a kind of moral neighborhood. And the moral neighborhood in the book, I suggested that what we have to do is attend to all those features when we're thinking about how it is that we can help people become their better selves. So, for instance, you might think, as I do, that most of social media is actually a bad moral neighborhood because there's all kinds of features of it that lead people to be not great versions of themselves. You know, the intent to like try to make score a point or get likes, like the kinds of motivations for that can really hinder the kinds of interactions and turn people into people they didn't necessarily want to be. And then if we do it well, sometimes hopefully like our classrooms or other social spaces can be good moral neighborhoods, places where people can interact with each other in a much better way, in a more dialogical way. And that recognizing that the way that happens isn't just like by announcing in this classroom, well, I'll be respectful. But you also have to think about how you are, how the space is arranged, what the power relationships are, what the physical space is, the extent to which people can move within that space and act and speak and listen. All of those things work together to be a moral neighborhood. And so part of the task for moral improvement is like working with other people to create these neighborhoods. And they can be really small. Like they could just be like an elevator for 5 minutes, or it could be a classroom for a semester. But creating those spaces where people can sort of live up to better versions of who, or sort of be more the person they want to be.
Yeah, because in social media, often if you're behaving thoughtfully, you're invisible
Yeah.
almost. The thing
Right.
that makes you visible is behaving badly.
Right. The structures of social media are set up to reward bad, what we regard as bad behavior. Like that's just how it works. Could it be structured differently? Of course, it would be a different kind of thing. But that's one of the ways, it's not physical, well, I guess it is, but that's one of the ways in which the sort of structures of something can facilitate or undermine various kinds of interactions that make it harder or easier for people to be good, to be the better versions of themselves.
Yeah, and of course it is, I suspect good moral neighborhoods can function on a bunch of scales, but that a classroom is one. and we play key roles as architects of those neighborhoods, or if we're in program student facing roles but not in curricular in courses, we also get to be the architects of retreats and clubs, and to some degree students also get to be the architects of those, to
Absolutely.
larger and larger degrees depending on how independent they are. um, so at this point, I'd welcome questions from the ECI community, and you could feel free to either enter them in the chat or raise your hands. I'll try to see you if you raise your real hand, but I'll have an easier time seeing you if you raise your virtual hand. And feel free to hop in on the moral neighborhoods question or any other concept that is of interest to you. And we'll give you a minute to get those in. I'll also just say, as the questions are rolling in, that your attention to physical space, how physical space shapes moral neighborhoods, it makes me think of, I think it's Elizabeth Anderson, who she was interpreting the Americans with Disabilities Act. And she says the thing that matters about that is not just that it makes Americans with disabilities lives easier. It's that it gives them access to public spaces and therefore to democratic participation. So it's not just about objective or subjective well-being or some base level of resources. It's about, can they adequately participate as equal members of society, which I thought was it seems analogous to the argument you're making about good moral neighborhoods.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and this obviously is well established in lots of other fields too, but the way in which design makes it easier or harder, like for people to interact well. And I think people don't often necessarily think about the moral relationships, but to me, because of the power differentials in place, it makes a huge difference. Like how students are seated in a classroom, like how they interact with each other, how they interact with me, and that attentiveness to the power differences. One of the things I talk about in the book too is, which I think is right, is for people who occupy a lot of social power, the significance of trying to do things to rearrange physical space if you can, but also the sort of social space to create a different, to sort of to shift boundaries around, particularly when it's crucial for helping people come to us a gathering of some kind as equals, as moral equals. Sometimes that requires that people do things quite differently in that space. And if you're someone who sort of has the social power or the actual like authority in a class to rearrange things, then very often that is something that you ought to do. But then trying to figure out like what techniques actually are effective for that, like what techniques enable students to like treat each other respectfully, like what has to happen there. I mean, this is a place which I think I find I'm kind of obsessed with Irving Goffman because I just think he's incredibly interesting, like philosophically interesting, but attending to like the nuances of what happens in a space, like as we're all used to, like students walking across campus, like when they're holding their phones versus not, or like when they have earphones, like all these things that we're so used to seeing, thinking about how we can structure spaces to facilitate the interactions that we think will help students make that progress toward whatever it is that they want to be.
Yeah, yeah. And so we have our first question in the chat. And Maureen, would you like to interpret this, or do you want us to just read it and answer it?
I don't know if it needs much interpretation without going into stories, but yeah, I love that. Like I said, I love the conclusion that moral improvement is really a communal project. But I know I have found myself personally in neighborhoods that weren't all that no moral, and so I'm just wondering, what's the best way forward?
I think that's a great question. I think my answer to that partly does depend on what the extent to which you're leaving the bad neighborhood will sort of be worse for everyone involved. I think this is just really difficult. I mean, I always, to make it more concrete, other people probably have this experience too. Like sometimes you're on committees where you feel like this is a good group, like we're really doing things, we're working toward a common goal, and it's working well on others that are just like soul sucking. And you're like, I need to get away from this, or what we some toxic. And certainly people might need to get out of those spaces for their own well-being. And I think that's legit too. I think though, we also have to think like, is that really what I'm doing? Or am I like abandoning a space that I should be trying to actually improve, even if I don't think it's going to work? So I don't know. I think my answer to that is just depend. I mean, the older I get or the more seniority I have at my institution or elsewhere, the more I'm like, actually, it's my job to try to change it. And so I should stay, even if I find it personally uncomfortable, and then using whatever methods I have. But I think it's a very different question for someone who either doesn't have much power in a particular context or whose whole life is filled with these things. And so may need to, like, if you're constantly trying to like sort of address these issues, you may need other kinds of spaces in which that doesn't, just to sort of maintain your own capacity to like, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I'm curious to know, like, do you have views on this?
And that's a good question for everybody.
Yeah.
When is it morally justified to leave a bad moral neighborhood? And when is it, um, does it feel morally obligatory to stay and try to seek its improvement? Um, I'll share just a little bit, although I want to hear from others, is that I really like your point about, um, or what I took from your point, which is that we only have so much time and energy, and we can't be dedicating ourselves to moral improvement of all of the cultures that we're in if they need a lot of reform. Like there's only so much a person has to give to
Yeah.
cultural renovation. So it's not an answer, but it's like one criteria of an answer.
Yeah, I like the architectural metaphors that you just keep picking up on the renovation of spaces. Whereas like sometimes you just have to demo them and start again. And sometimes I think that actually is the right answer, but then trying to figure out what that is and then who's affected for better or for
For
worse
work.
by it. Like that, I think that some of the trying to identify like the subtleties in trying to assess when you don't necessarily know what like how the power relationships are working in a space. It can take a long time, I think, to sort that out before you really know what you can do, if anything at all.
Yeah, because if you it renovation projects take a lot of resources too. Like you might not even have the resources, like the material resources, in addition to the power dynamics to do it. Glenn, what's your question?
Thank you so much. I really like the book. It was very, very helpful. Um, the agenda of moral improvement reminds me of Ben Franklin's efforts
Mm-hmm.
and his frustrations ultimately at the possibility. Um, and I always read that list as essentially ironic. So, my concern is that I seldom have a clear enough sense of my own moral aspirations. And I certainly don't think my students have much sense of their moral aspirations. They seem to be fooling themselves, and I seem to be fooling myself most of the time. And no matter how much I say to myself, I aspire to be a patient driver, I never find myself in the right community or the right neighborhood, or I will feel good about it and then fail miserably, and I'm back to square one. So that's the problem.
Yeah.
The thing I'd like to hear you comment upon, however, is the rituals that we might establish to help us. And I'm reminded here of the ECI's emphasis on moral reminders.
Yeah, that's a great. Oh, yeah. So a lot of my professional life is actually devoted to working on Immanuel Kant. And part of the reason for that is one of the things I like about Kant is he's worried about exactly the same thing, particularly about the sort of the challenges of knowing both like sort of what he doesn't find it so challenging to figure out what we're supposed to be like, but he worries a lot about self-deception, rationalization, delusions, all of those things where we convince ourselves, like the real challenge of getting like in some sense a good look at ourselves. He thinks this is really, really hard. And he has some like ideas about how you might go about this. but which may or may not be well grounded psychologically. But this idea of like the habits is really interesting. Like this, partly this like sort of knowing yourself. So like, for instance, you know, having spent so much time in traffic, I know some of the things that make sort of stress me out. Like what I have to, I try to act like a stoic actually when I'm driving. But like lately I've been telling myself, I'm like, you know, like it is not my job. Like I'm not trying to thwart other drivers. Like it sounds like such a strange thing to do. Like obviously I'm not trying to thwart other drivers, but trying to like remind myself like this is not like what I'm about, or changing like music, like thinking about this. If I listen to podcasts, they make me angry. Like that, we all know how that goes, right? You're angry. Like I think actually this kind of like the moral reminders, but also that kind of recognition, like, all right, this is a circumstance in which I know I tend to be angry. And then thinking about these like diffusing strategies that we all do. There's a lot of self-knowledge that I think has to be involved, and also a recognition of the ways in which the sort of the external circumstances affect how we're thinking, what we're doing, how we respond to other people. You know, obviously in a car, the fact that the person is further removed and often you can't see them shapes how we act, I think. And so I think all of those things, awareness of them is really important. But there is a lot of this just trying to sort of figure out, just like knowing things about psychology in general, but also about our particular psychologies, which is something you learn over time, I think, as you figure out like, oh, this is actually making me really angry and stressed. This is not. I should listen to this station, not that station. I'm just really being self-revelatory about my bad drive, my DC driving habits.
And I also think there's something here for character educators too, that we can build the rituals, which I think is part of your account of a good neighborhood, is the that rituals, which are social in nature, they're
Yeah.
communal, can give us those moral reminders that help us more frequently develop habits.
The reminders, and also like at least in the Confucian tradition, right, also shaping of things, like that sort of conforming your body to what the expectation, and like doing things also then shapes who you are on the inside. So yeah, so the reminders, but also the actual like confirmation of the inner with the outer. Sorry, little diversion there.
No, it's not a diversion. Heidi?
Hi, thanks so much. So I'm shamelessly going to ask for a spoiler here because I sadly have not gotten to the end of your book yet. But the talk about the possibility that demoing the moral neighborhood is the right thing to do in some cases makes me wonder what you have to say about agreeableness. And I assume you're going to talk about the upsides and downsides of being agreeable. And yeah, I think that must tie in. And just more generally, I'm super curious what you have to say about agreeableness.
I find agreeableness really, really interesting because it's so the last three chapters of the book are all about social practices. There are three social practices that I think can be used really well or also really badly, with agreeableness being one of them. So I think there is a kind of just general speaking duty to be agreeable in the sense, so like Kant talks about as being sort of cheerful, but being agreeable in the sense of being open to like what Goffman calls like face engagement, like to interaction. So my favorite example of this is like you're on public transportation or something, you have, you know, a bag in the seat next to you, you're on a Southwest flight or something, right? And that we all know this drill, like you don't want someone to sit next to you, but also it's not really your seat, right? And so people do lots of things to try to like not engage. And so I think that our default stance has to be at least a kind of a willingness to engage with people at a level that's, I see you, and if you need assistance, I'm at least willing to help you. And I think a lot of that consists in how we sort of present ourselves, and like, you know, whether people are holding phones, like all the things that we're doing. But that's a very broad stretch, and how that actually plays out in practice is of course very different depending on what your social position is. Some people get asked for things more often. Some people, their boundaries get intruded upon more frequently than others. Agreeableness is an expectation for some people when it isn't for others. Some people are told to smile all the time. Some people are not. So there's all of these layers to it that make it really, really hard to know exactly what practices of being agreeable are. I mean, I think it's important in the sense that it's a way of acknowledging that other people are there and have claim sort of like in a position to make claims on us. And that's the kind of thing that we acknowledge through, say, eye contact, or through the way in which we hold our bodies or move things around or just engage. But there's also constraints on what we either should have to do, or if we fall into a group where these practices don't work out particularly well for us, then that calls for modifications as well. But you think it should be demoed? Are you thinking like this is like such a mess the way this works out?
Not necessarily. I don't have a particular moral neighborhood in mind, although in my own life, like I demoed my social media presence.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I didn't have anything particular in mind asking the question. It just sounded like demoing
Yeah.
things would be a disagreeable thing to do, and sometimes being
Yeah.
disagreeable might be just fine.
I mean, kind of think social media is the most obvious place of something to demo. I mean, I don't know. I just obviously it depends on what the social media format is. And my experience is, like a 55-year-old view of social media, which is different from my, Gen Z daughters. But I mean, I'm struck by, I don't know if people are too, that like people, I'm sure we all have this, like people who we know to be really nice, like have really good character traits in person, like don't act like that on social media. I also think people are sometimes like, I see people who I know to be really good philosophers saying stuff sometimes on social media. I'm like, that's a terrible argument. Like you would know that. Like if anybody, like, come on, this is like logic 101. Like there's so much of that. And this is, I mean, social media obviously has many pluses as well, but it's just really hard to use well. And the norms drive us toward a kind of interaction that I think maybe demoing is the thing to do. But this is it depends on what we're demoing. I don't know.
Yeah. It seems like there's demoing a moral neighborhood, which would be something like making like getting rid of a platform entirely, or maybe on a smaller scale, like leaving a marriage, like you're dissolving the relationships that constitute the moral neighborhood.
Yeah.
And that's another is abandonment of a moral neighborhood. Like the neighborhood still exists, the organization or the committee is still there, but you leave it. And then there's this other, which is renovation of the moral neighborhood, of you know, creating new norms. And we talked a little bit yesterday about students being able to reflect on norms around use of headphones and earbuds and other kinds of shields.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about how you've seen students be able to reflect on and maybe even build norms? Maybe just in the context of a classroom?
Yeah, the phone thing is, of course, always comes up. So this is the involvement shield is a term of Goffman's. Am I lagging? It looks like I am on my
Just
side.
a little bit. It's not bad
Okay.
though.
I don't know why this always happens on Zoom. So it's not a Wi-Fi thing, but the I think that the idea of I'll close out a browser, see if this helps. Goffman has this idea of an involvement shield, which is like a physical object, doesn't have to be physical, but often things that we do to sort of set up the boundaries of spaces. So phones and headphones are clear involvement shields. People pull them out if they don't want to talk to someone, but we can do it for good too. Like if people are trying to have a private conversation, and you're like something comes up and you're like, oh, I'll just be over here on my phone, you're sort of pretending you're not hearing them. So they have a lot of functions. um, and I mean, we often talk about phones as sort of distractions to attention, which obviously is important, but also I think it's helpful to students to think the ways in which phones or people's reliance on phones is impeding things that they want to happen in a classroom. I also sometimes get students, like I'll have them like do peer stuff. I'll have them like try this sitting next to each other, try this facing each other, try this like in different physical arrangements so that you can kind of see what produces, like it's uncomfortable to look at someone in the eyes. And if you're not comfortable, that's fine with that too, but it changes what you're doing. And so I think some of it is also just trying to get students to reflect on how it changes things if everybody is walking through campus with headphones or earbuds in or on their phones, if they're not. And then they can think, yeah, okay, but it's super convenient for me to be able to text my friends and say we're going to have lunch. So I really want it to be this way. Like, no problem. But thinking about that is, I think students are really keen on thinking about that. And I think that in the classroom, I'm usually trying to do it in terms of presence. Like, what is it that is like this would block for you? Or what is it that it's also achieving if it's helping you like step out of an uncomfortable like interaction. Sometimes that can be really, really valuable for students, especially once you have social anxiety or something else, or depending on the topic, but also like whether it's blocking you from having the interactions that you want to have. Yeah, did that answer? I was so caught up on my lag that I can't understand, that I don't understand, but does
No,
that
you
answer that?
Well, first of all, you did a brilliant job of explaining what an involvement shield is, and that students are able to identify when they're strategically using those,
Yeah.
and and even when they're not strategically using those, what it just does to a social environment. Um, how have you engaged? I guess my question is, how have you engaged students in building a moral neighborhood and in building the shared aspirations of a moral neighborhood in a classroom?
Yeah, I think some of it is trying to get them to see the ways in which the spaces are affecting them. So like if they're turning their chairs, like sort of calling their attention to things, like about what are the things that are sort of blocking them in the physical space. And then in terms of the norms of social interaction, I mean, students are well aware of this. Sometimes it's just calling their attention to this. So sometimes if I'm doing something, I tend to explain it a lot, being like, you all come in and people sit in the same places in this, we all know this, right? We all do it too. Like they sit in the same seats in the classroom. We're like, right, here's some reasons why you might do that. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also good to not just talk to the people next to you, but also sit in a different space so that you have this kind of different perspective. So I'm really transparent about it. I don't know. I mean, because if it's your class, you still get to impose it on them whether or not they want it. So I mean, I think it's very different when you have like students trying to set up their own space. And so it's also trying to get them to set up their own norms, which they, have plenty of practice in, but articulating why they're doing it is, I think, important. Like, what will this get us if we have this rule in place? I've also thought a lot about Robert's Rules of Orders, which I don't use in classrooms, but my department uses a lot, just as ways of structuring interaction and discussion. So I think like having norms about how things work is really helpful for students, but you also want to be flexible about it, obviously, so students don't feel like they're excessively constrained.
Right. Well, it sounds like first and foremost, like what you do is you make norms transparent. You make them more legible. We talked about being legible to each other, but just and I think this is why people love Jane Austen in some way,
Yeah.
because she's giving the social commentary, but that's how you know what all the rules are, because you can see people breaking them. And but you're helping them become interpreters of their moral neighborhoods. Just the first step is seeing what are the norms and what are the constraints and the opportunities that are arising from the physical locations, and then what are the norms that I'm imposing through the rules of this classroom, and what are the norms that y'all are creating through your just habitual interactions. And I do think there's something really valuable about helping them just see that moral neighborhood building is happening all the way around them, because it makes it, then they can be, when they leave your classroom, your moral neighborhood, then they have a chance to go build it in a club or in a residence hall, and they can be more proactive choosers. I know that's not the main thrust of your book, but I do think that that's one of the implications, is that they can learn how to recognize what's constructing their moral neighborhoods or what's organizing it.
Yeah, and what's preventing people or enabling people to act as better versions of themselves, like what kinds of things are making people more difficult. Like sometimes like it's really hard for people. This is sort of Kant's view, I think. It's hard not to hate people sometimes. And so like what are the constraints that make it harder for people like to go into a classroom, or like, find it difficult to engage with them as like fellow human beings? And what you're trying to achieve obviously is different in different classrooms, but I think that getting them just to attend to that, what we ask them to tell us about themselves, our students tend to be very focused. Their leaders are all a bunch of high school valedictorian, student body president, athletic team captains. They're very focused on that, and trying to get them to see like what are the other parts of a person that you want to know about or that you hear, and how do you elicit that information so you can find out who else they are. Things like that, and how that changes a conversation. I think students are attentive to that, but articulating it and helping them articulate it and empower them to do things in other spaces, I think is really helpful for them.
gives them all kinds of opportunities to develop new social roles and new aspirations. Okay, we are nearing the end of our time. And Karen, do you have anything else that you think we just need to know? A burning desire of some kind?
No, but people should read the Remains of the Day because it's really good. In all your spare time. There's a movie. If you don't have that, the movie is also really good. It's very timely.
I mean, I love Emma Thompson, so that's a good enough reason for me to watch it.
Yeah.
But I want to end by just saying, Remains of the Day aside, it was a tremendous treat to read Minding the Gap. And I will say it's a beach read. I read it on the beach.
Wow.
And enjoyed it. And I'm really, really grateful for you giving us a language to talk about something close to character development, the moral improvement that doesn't require us to talk so much in virtue language. I think that's a real gift and something that I'm going to keep on borrowing from in the way I interact with the ECI community. So with that, I think we should wrap up just a couple minutes early. Thank you everybody for coming. We hope to see you on October 14th for the webinar and October 23rd for our next book club. And if everyone could give a round of applause for Karen for being here and sharing her ideas with us. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the conversation.
Take care. Have a good day.